Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most seismic moments in European history. A day that would decide the fate of an empire and redraw the map of the world. We're talking about the Battle of Waterloo. Picture this, June 18th, 1815. A muddy field in what is now Belgium. On one side, the legendary Emperor of the French, Napoleon Bonaparte, a military genius who had clawed his way back from exile. On the other, the stoic and unflappable Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, leading a coalition of British, Dutch, and German forces. This wasn't just a battle, it was the ultimate showdown. It was Napoleon's final, desperate gamble to reclaim his glory. So, who truly danced the last waltz on that fateful day? Grab your shako hats, folks, because we're about to find out. To understand Waterloo, we have to rewind a bit. Napoleon, the man who had conquered most of Europe, had been defeated and exiled to the tiny island of Elba. The great powers of Europe breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the Napoleonic Wars were finally over. But they underestimated the emperor's ambition. In March 1815, in an event that sounds like it's straight out of a Hollywood movie, Napoleon escaped Elba, landed in France, and rallied the nation behind him without firing a single shot. The so-called 100 Days had begun. The restored King Louis XVIII fled, and Napoleon was once again on the throne. Europe was stunned. The Seventh Coalition, including Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, immediately declared war, not on France, but on Napoleon himself. They saw him as the single greatest threat to peace and stability. The stage was set for a final, decisive confrontation. Napoleon knew his only chance was to strike first and fast. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity: divide and conquer. The Allied forces were gathering in Belgium. Wellington's Anglo-Allied army was based around Brussels, while the Prussian army, under the grizzled veteran Gebhard von Blücher, was to the east. Napoleon's strategy was to drive a wedge between them, defeat each army separately before they could unite, and force the coalition to the negotiating table. He was a master of speed and surprise, and he believed he could outmaneuver both Wellington and Blücher. On June 15th, he crossed the border into Belgium, catching the Allies somewhat off guard. The campaign had begun. The initial clashes at Quatre Bras and Ligny on June 16th were a mixed bag. Napoleon managed to defeat the Prussians at Ligny, but not decisively. Wellington held his ground at Quatre Bras. The crucial part is this: the Prussian army, though battered, wasn't destroyed. They retreated, not away from Wellington, but parallel to him, a move that would prove absolutely critical. And so, we arrive at the morning of June 18th. The previous night had seen a torrential downpour, turning the battlefield into a quagmire of mud. This was the first of many things that went wrong for Napoleon. The wet ground delayed his attack for several hours, as he couldn't effectively move his heavy artillery, the pride of his army. This delay gave the Prussians, who were marching to reinforce Wellington, precious time. Wellington, a master of defensive warfare, had chosen his ground carefully. He positioned the bulk of his army on the reverse slope of a ridge, shielding them from Napoleon's devastating artillery fire. His line was anchored by three key strongpoints: the chateau of Hougoumont on his right, the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte in the center, and the farms of Papelotte and La Haye on his left. He knew he just had to hold on until Blücher and the Prussians arrived. His entire strategy was a race against time. Around 11:30 a.m., Napoleon finally gave the order to attack. The battle began with a massive French assault on the chateau of Hougoumont. Napoleon intended this as a diversion to draw Wellington's reserves to the right flank, but the fight for Hougoumont became a brutal battle within the battle. A small contingent of Allied guardsmen held the fortified chateau with incredible courage against waves of French attackers all day long. Their heroic defense tied up thousands of French troops, completely foiling Napoleon's diversionary plan. This stubborn defense of a single chateau was the first sign that this day would not go according to the emperor's script. The fight for Hougoumont was a relentless, bloody struggle that raged for hours, a microcosm of the entire battle's ferocity. With the fight for Hougoumont bogging down his troops, Napoleon turned his attention to Wellington's centre. He ordered a massive infantry assault led by Marshal d'Erlon's corps. Tens of thousands of French soldiers marched in dense columns up the muddy slope toward the Allied line. It was a terrifying sight. They successfully pushed back the Dutch-Belgian troops in Wellington's front line and were about to break through. But Wellington was ready. At the critical moment, he ordered his heavy cavalry, the Scots Greys and the Household Brigade, to charge. The British horsemen crashed into the French infantry with devastating effect, scattering them and sending them fleeing back down the ridge. The charge was a spectacular success, but the cavalry, caught up in the heat of the moment, went too far. They charged past the French lines and were eventually counterattacked and decimated by French lancers. Both sides had suffered heavy losses, but Wellington's centre had held. The line was bent, but not broken. Now for one of the most controversial moments of the battle, the great French cavalry charge. Seeing Allied troops withdrawing from the ridge to reform, French Marshal Ney mistook this movement for a general retreat. Without direct orders from Napoleon, Ney launched a massive, unsupported cavalry charge against Wellington's centre. Over 5,000 French cuirassiers and lancers thundered up the slope, but Wellington's infantry was prepared. They formed into defensive squares, creating bristling hedgehogs of bayonets that the cavalry could not break. For hours, the finest cavalry in Europe charged again and again, swirling around the immovable squares, but they were mown down by disciplined volleys of musket fire. It was an epic display of courage and futility. Napoleon, watching from a distance, could only lament, "Ney is wasting my cavalry." These brave men and their horses were being sacrificed for nothing, weakening Napoleon's army at a crucial juncture. While the cavalry charges were failing, a desperate struggle was taking place for the farmhouse of Sainte in the centre of the battlefield. This modest farm was the key to Wellington's position. After repelling multiple attacks, the brave German defenders finally ran out of ammunition. The French swarmed in and captured the farmhouse in the late afternoon. This was Napoleon's moment. With Sainte in his hands, he could bring up his artillery and pound Wellington's centre at point-blank range. The Allied line began to buckle under the intense bombardment. Wellington's situation was becoming desperate. He was seen riding along his lines, encouraging his men, famously saying, "Hard pounding this, gentlemen. Let's see who will pound longest." It was at this moment that the battle hung precariously in the balance. Victory was within Napoleon's grasp. But then, on the eastern horizon, the first signs of black uniforms appeared. The Prussians had arrived. Blücher had kept his promise. Napoleon was now facing the nightmare scenario he had tried so hard to avoid, a battle on two fronts. He was forced to divert his last reserves, the elite young and old guard, to hold off the Prussians who were now attacking his right flank. The pressure was immense. With his flank being crushed by the newly arrived Prussians, Napoleon knew he had one last roll of the dice. He gathered the remaining battalions of his legendary Imperial Guard, the finest soldiers in his army, who had never known defeat, for one final cataclysmic assault on Wellington's centre. This was it, the Emperor's endgame. Under the command of Marshal Ney, the Imperial Guard marched forward in the fading light of the evening. They advanced with grim determination, the cry of "Vive l'Empereur" on their lips. They pushed back the battered British infantry, and for a moment, it looked like they might succeed where all others had failed. But Wellington was there, waiting. At the perfect moment, he gave a now famous order. "Now, Maitland, now's your time." Over 1,500 British foot guards, who had been lying down on the reverse slope, rose as one and unleashed a devastating point-blank volley into the Guard's flank. The seemingly invincible Imperial Guard faltered. They stopped, and then, for the first time in their history, they broke and ran. The cry went up across the battlefield. "La Garde Recule! The Guard retreats!" The psychological impact was shattering. Seeing their elite comrades fleeing, the entire French army dissolved into panic and chaos. Wellington, sensing the decisive moment, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat in the air, the signal for a general advance. His entire line surged forward, and the French retreat turned into a rout. The battle was over. The field was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Napoleon fled the field, his empire collapsing behind him. He would abdicate a few days later and be exiled for the final time to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would die 6 years later. The Duke of Wellington and Marshal Blücher met at the Inn of La Belle Alliance, celebrating their hard-won victory. The Battle of Waterloo marked the definitive end of the Napoleonic Wars and ushered in a century of relative peace in Europe, often called the Pax Britannica. It was a day of immense courage, costly mistakes, and incredible turning points. Wellington's defensive genius and the timely arrival of the Prussians had triumphed over Napoleon's desperate final gamble. The last waltz was over, and it was Wellington who remained standing on the dance floor of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back to 1815. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal battles, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next adventure. Let me know in the comments what you think was the most decisive moment of the battle. Until next time, stay curious.